Joint practice session with the Tampa Bay Bucs produced some hits and misses. Unfortunately, one of the misses is something that y'all don't want to hear. But I'm going to tell you anyway here today on Locked On Jaguars.
You are Locked On Jaguars, your daily Jacksonville Jaguars podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is your team every day, and we thank you for making us your first listen here on Locked On Jaguars. We thank all of our listeners and our everydayers, and we want to make sure you know where to reach us. That is over on YouTube or wherever you get your audio platform, whatever platform you use audio-wise to listen to podcasts. Make sure you check us out each and every single day. We are very, very grateful to have you with us today. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book. As playoffs have winded down in some sports, the sports stop sporting in others like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, something there for everyone. Every day, all summer long, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Joint sessions with the Tampa Bay Bucs here in Jacksonville. Very, very nice, good day out at the stadium and to practice the Miller Electric practice facility. Here's what we're going to talk about. Some of the hits and misses. And there were some misses, ones that you are familiar with. We'll get back to the hits in just a second. We're going to talk about ways that you can overcome those misses. But before we do that, in segment 2, we're going to talk about the fact that we need to have a talk, another long talk about the offensive line. Now, that's the miss. But before we do that, I'm going to run back up top real quick and get all of this stuff right to you as fast as I can. Here's what we're going to do. Brian Thomas Jr., a hit. Brian Thomas Jr. got behind the defense today and made a huge catch. And the most impressive part about it was at the time he made his break on a post route, he was dead even with the defensive back. And when the ball got in the air, and this is what I've always said about great receivers like Antonio Brown, Jamar Chase, there's something to be said that when the ball is in the air and guys have their head turned, they can accelerate through drills. Remember when Keon Coleman didn't run fast in the draft in the 40-yard dash, but in the drill, he had the highest speed because that's called functional speed, where Brian Thomas Jr. has functional speed. He separated about 3.5 steps once the ball got in the air. He was overthrown earlier, and then he caught it. Loudest roar I have heard in a practice that included fans in a long, long time. You'd have thought he scored the game-winning touchdown in week 1 in Miami or something. So that's a good hit. Trevor Lawrence was super, super sharp today, along with, I believe Mac Jones was very, very sharp also in practice. Hit a plethora of receivers. Some guys had drops. Everything was one. He had a drop that he should have caught. Parker Washington let one get away from him. And but other than that, really, really good. Tank Bigsby had another huge, huge day as we continue to talk about the hits from training camp. Tank Bigsby, he just seems like he's so much more confident and quick than he was last year. He was always in good shape. He really is and still is in very good shape. He seems like everything around him. The reason why he seems like he's going faster is because everything around him looks like it slowed down for him. And he's just playing instinctively and naturally in practice. You saw it carry over to the game last week where he played really, really well in the game from the line of scrimmage as well as on special teams. He was a trip away from basically housing a kickoff return. So that continued. And this is what you want to see if you're a Jaguar fan. You want to see things that are consistently strung together to the point where they start becoming normal. And when it starts becoming normal enough, you start having the expectation that it's always going to happen. And I think we're starting to see some of those things with the two players in particular that I just mentioned. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that Brenton Strange had the best day I've ever seen him have. He caught like 3 balls. So they had a whole bunch, right? But that just goes to show you the balls that he caught, how he caught the passes. He caught them downfield. He caught them diving for balls. He caught it in stride. We've seen him drop those passes in the past, or we've just seen him not throw the ball because he wasn't open. Brenton Strange, the second-year player out of Penn State, who was a second-round pick, had a very, very good practice at a time when we really thought I was standing over there with Ryan Green from 1010XL, my man Hacker, and we were just talking about how he needs to have something happen for him because as a second round pick, he couldn't crack the starting lineup so far with Evan Ingram and Luke Farrell. We were bragging on Luke Farrell, and then all of a sudden, boom, there he is, just like that. The guy steps up, Brenton Strange steps up and makes a play. Spoke to Ryan Nielsen in prior to practice and asked him about some players, particularly Trayvon Walker, who also is looking the part in practice. See all the hits now. The hits are feeling good. So we're going to get to the misses in just a second. But he spoke about Trayvon in glowing fashion, talked about all of the things he is: big, fast, twitchy. And the thing he pointed his finger and said, and you guys can see that interview on Jaguars.com or the Jacksonville Jaguars YouTube page where he pointed his finger and said, let me tell you something. And when he said it, he said, the thing about him is he's a hard worker. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He says, he is first out there. He's last. He is a hard worker. He wants to be great. I mean, he just went on and on and on. Now, this is a guy who's the defensive coordinator, but he's a defensive line coach by trade. And I had heard glowing things about him from the teams that he's covered in the past, my Locked On affiliates, whether it be Aaron Freeman with Atlanta Locked On Falcons or Ross Jackson with Locked On Saints. They told me how good of a guy he is, and he's a great communicator. Great communicators have a habit of not just saying things articulately, but they have a habit of really, really, really being deadly honest. Like he doesn't leave any room for anything to be not true. When you can get a guy like that, like Ryan Nielsen, to glow when he's talking about a football player that happens to play the position where by trade, that was his position to coach as he was coming up through the ranks, that is a big deal for me. So yeah, big time efforts by a lot of people that people may have had questions about. And now we get to this. As the late, great Paul Harvey says, now the rest of the story. I'm looking for a reason not to be worried about this team, but I can't ignore it any longer. And I don't think I've been ignoring it, but I've been hesitant and I've been really, really weary of over talking something in the preseason, whether it be good or bad. And the reason why I'm talking about the good today is because it's stringing along. It's not good and bad days with the guys that I mentioned. Those guys are putting good days. We hear coaches talk about it all the time. Put these good days together over and over again. And that's what's happening with the people that I mentioned. Trevor Lawrence, also, by the way, sharp, razor sharp today. All right. And there were a lot of other people, but I'm focusing on the ones that really, really caught my eye in these joint sessions. And now I'm going to focus on the ones that did not. I'm not going to talk about the offensive line individually because I don't think Anton Harrison had a bad practice. I talked to him after practice. In fact, I think he had a good practice. That's the right tackle. I don't think the left tackle, Cam Robinson, had a bad practice. Spoke briefly to him too. They didn't have bad practices. The offensive line as a group, when they were doing 11 on 11. As I spoke to Jaguars legend Leon Searcy about the game against the Chiefs, and I said, look, the offensive line, yeah, they didn't play well, but they were missing two people. He said, nonsense. The Chiefs Chris Jones didn't play. And it put in perspective to me that I was preparing to give a mulligan or make an excuse for the offensive line. So coming up in segment 2, I'm going to be honest with you. And this is the time of year that it's hard to be honest because everybody's enthusiasm is sky high. And mine is, it's okay. But I'm going to be honest with you about the offensive line. I'm going to tell you things that I've always thought about the line, why this team is consistent with those things. And what I've always said about the offensive line is you can't hide it. If it's bad, it's going to cost you something. By the time we get to segment 3, I'm going to let you know that, yeah, I think they got some problems. And I don't even know exactly what it is. I don't know if it's one person or if it's the whole group, but it doesn't seem like they can block people well enough. It just doesn't. That is a concern that we have had for years. That is something that was minimally addressed, in my opinion, in the offseason. Was it another mistake by the Jaguars? We're going to answer that question and tell you exactly what I think is wrong and then set ourselves up that by segment 3, I'm going to tell you why you can still be optimistic that we're going to have a very, very competitive season. I'll give you a couple examples of that and reasons why I don't want you to jump off the don't jump off the ledge. All right, just don't do it. There's a chance that this team can really overcome that. I'll tell you about all of that. I'll detail the problems and tell you some of the solutions or some of the things that I believe they can do to overcome it. And we'll do all of that in segment number 2 coming up here in just a second on Locked On Jaguars. I love sports, and I hope you do too. I hope y'all love sports just as much as I do. And if you do, you never really want them to stop, right? You always want them to keep going the way they were already going. You want your sports to be sporting, man. You don't want to sit here and have to figure out what you're going to watch and, more importantly, what you're going to bet on when you go to FanDuel, because FanDuel is the absolute truth, man. Playing on FanDuel makes everything so much better and so much fun. And when you have a chance to win you some money, it's even better. So guess what? This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long, while we're waiting on the games to start. So head to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. Now do it right now, man. FanDuel has something for everyone, all customers, and they'll give you a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Segment number 2 here on Locked On Jaguars. We're at your team every day. We thank you for making us your first listen, always here on Locked On Jaguars. Let's get right to it, man. I said I was going to have you with hits and misses. I gave you all the good stuff. I let you eat your dessert first. I told you about Brian Thomas Jr. having, somebody asked me, was it a Randy Moss moment? I don't know anybody that's like Randy Moss, but it was like an A.J. Green moment, okay? I told you that Trevor Lawrence played well. I told you that I don't think that Anton Harrison or I don't think that Cam Robinson had bad games or bad days today. So there were some good things. There were some things. Trayvon Walker looked great as always. Your players that are making a lot of money and guys that were drafted very high, they look good. Brenton Strange had a good game. Now here we go. We got to get to the other side of it. The offensive line, especially the interior, was atrocious. It was enough to sound an alarm that maybe some of the things that we are saying about the offensive line that we believe, well, we're just watching them work, it's just practice. No, it looks like last year. Does that mean that Mitch Morse, the center that they acquired from Buffalo in the offseason, does that mean he wasn't the answer to Luke Fortner? No, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean it at all. But it does make me ask a question. If Mitch Morse only cost, $5, $6, $7 million for the Jaguars, even though he's 32 years old, why did Buffalo let him go? It obviously, he wasn't expensive to keep. Do they love that young guy they have up there just that much? I may have to reach out to Joe Marino and find out, who covers Locked On Bills, and find out. And the reason why I bring that question up is because I had a GM friend of mine, a guy who used to be a GM, who's still an executive in the league, tell me the thing with free agents, you always have to wonder why they're free. Why are they free? Ezra Cleveland was acquired. That's the right guard. He was acquired at the trade deadline for a 6th-round pick last year, and then the Jaguars re-signed him. Phil Rauscher, the offensive line coach, has history with him. I think he believes in it. You have to ask yourself, now put yourself in my shoes and everybody else's shoes. This is something that we didn't really want to know, because sometimes every person's trash can be somebody else's treasure. Who in their right mind trades a 26-year-old guard for a 6th-round pick at the trade deadline? I don't care what stage the team is in, how they're rebuilding. That's something that I personally wanted to look past, because I was like, some things that are some people's trash, I'll say it again, is some people's treasure. And then when you look at PFF about Brandon Sheriff, now I'm talking about the 3 spots in the middle, from guard to guard, center, guard. Brandon Sheriff rated kind of high last year. And I had even local people here, other content creators and media people tell me, Nah, man, he really wasn't that bad. He wasn't terrible. My only complaint about him last year was that he was on the ground too much. Even though he always came back into the game, it just seems like anytime they get something going, and maybe it's just me, it might not be that deep, but it feels like 68's on the ground again. Come on, man. You're breaking up momentum. You leave for a plate and you come back, and you know what's going on here. Well, the tape evidently suggested that Brandon Sheriff wasn't that bad. I'm not saying he was that bad. I had a talk with Leon Searcy today, longtime legend, offensive line, and he told me, I just want him to have a stalemate. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, just a stalemate. Just don't get dominated. Just don't be falling down like Shaq with your feet all in the air on tape. Just don't let guys blow. He said too many times they're not even doing that. Wig, they're not even playing it even. Shout out to Leon Searcy. He's right. This is all before practice, so we watch it and we say, well, we didn't like last year. We didn't like the preseason. We didn't really like what we seen earlier this year. They got everybody out there. Let's see what happens. And they looked like the Bucs had 5 Vita Veas on their offense, on their defensive line. There were plays, even the play that Brian Thomas Jr. made where Trevor Lawrence hit him deep like for an 80-yard pass for a touchdown. And the crowd went crazy. Most media said that's a sack. Because they, even though we were 11-11 and they had on pads, they weren't making full contact. That was a sack, Wig. They could have blown the whistle in the play, and Trevor doesn't even get that ball off in real time. There were other plays where the whistle came out quick. Trevor threw the ball into the ground. Guys were coming unblocked, even when they weren't blitzing. And, oh, man, if they blitz, especially if they blitz through the middle, it was a wrap. It's not necessarily the guys on the boundary. It's not Cam, and it's not, well, it's Walker Little when he's in the game, but it's not Cam, and it's not Anton Harrison. I'm not concerned about them as much. And this is why one of the reasons everybody said, why they keeping Cam for all that money at left tackle? Well, one of the reasons is because he's probably their second best offensive lineman. And though he might not be as good as some people want him to be, how can you trade the second best offensive lineman you have when that is the weakest unit on the team? I'm concerned. They're also not running the ball in the preseason games. They're not running the ball well in practice. Come on, y'all saw it. When it was ones versus ones, they didn't run the ball very well. They ran the ball when the reserves were in. If they didn't even run when they had their ones in and the other team had their twos in on the offensive line, they still weren't running. Kansas City, the Saturday. That is a concern. It is a big concern for me. The concern is that Trent Baalke, although I have given him credit for knowing that the interior offensive line market was going to go through the roof, all you got to do is look at what Carolina did. They spent a boatload of money, and other teams that were giving these guards money like they were tackles. And it happens sometimes that they had their finger on the pulse of what it was going to look like even before the champion period and say, we ain't going there. That's too much. We can't do that. They did go overkill, in my opinion, on the defensive line because they got Eric Armstead and then they drafted 2 people on day 2 and day 3 of the draft. That might be their saving grace. And you ask me, Wig, how can the offensive line be saved by the defensive line? And I'll tell you, you go back to 2017 and the same way the offense as a whole was saved by Jacksonville, the defense. By coming up with an identity. And that is what we're going to talk about in segment 3. How can they overcome if this thing doesn't improve? And I don't know how you can improve it at this point. Ain't nobody going to trade you anybody that's good unless one of these young guys up jumps the boogie and all of a sudden outplays somebody. I don't think that's going to happen, even though somebody did tell me today that Cooper Hodges, or it wasn't Cooper, it was Blake Hance, that Blake Hance went in at guard and Ezra Cleveland came out, and there wasn't nothing wrong with Ezra Cleveland. I didn't see that because I was watching 100 players, but well, no, it was close to 200, 180 guys, offense and defense on different fields. But they told me that. Maybe is that it? Is there increased competition? We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it if it's even possible for them to overcome that in segment number 3. First, I'm going to let you know, though, that I want to appreciate you and thank you for making Locked On Jaguars your first listen. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies you can so you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm going to tell you how the Jaguars can overcome all of this foolishness that's going on in the interior of the offensive line. And I'm going to do it in just a second here on Locked On Jaguars. Today's show is brought to you and sponsored by BetterHelp. That is right. Everybody could use therapy sometimes. I wasn't a believer until I actually needed it, and it has helped me tremendously. It has helped me with things that I couldn't imagine, overcoming pain problems and pain management, death in the family. I had that all happen within the last year, and I needed therapy for that. And then there's this thing called time management. When you have so many things that you want to do, but you just can't find the time to do it. Believe it or not, it could lead to you feeling guilty like it did me. Here's what you need. Go to BetterHelp, especially if you just want to give therapy a try. If you want to give it a try, there's no better place to do it than BetterHelp. It's online. It's completely online. Man, and I'm telling you, even when you go online and you fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, you can still switch therapists at any time for no additional charge if it just doesn't feel right for you. I'm telling you, man, when your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, all the things that can overwhelm you, it's easy to let your priorities slip. BetterHelp will get you straight. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. I'm going to spell that for you. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. That's LOCKEDON. Hit BetterHelp up today to get 10% off your first month. Thank you for making Locked On Jaguars your first listen and making us your team every day and making us your first listen. We're talking about hits and misses. We've mentioned the hits, and you now know where the misses lie. And I have to say something. If you've heard this podcast before, you're familiar with me and my criticism of the offensive line. If it's your first time listening and you heard me just say that, I am not trying to justify my opinion on that offensive line based on, and come on here and tell you. Ask anybody. All you got to do is just follow all the local experts, the people that follow this team every single day. Josh Allen mentioned something about local too, and I'll tell you that later on. But the local experts, everyone will tell you the offensive line is a problem. There were folks sitting in the media room trying to figure out, we're not overreacting, are we? And everybody else looked at them and said, no, we feel it too. So it's justified, right? Look at the first quarter of the game last Saturday against the Chiefs. Compare that to last year and what ailed this team: short yardage running, being able to protect Trevor and keep him on his line so he can keep looking down the field and use that arm to make those throws. We discussed the play calling yesterday and how the play calling was affected by offensive line play, and we were hoping to get a better gauge of offensive coordinator Press Taylor and his ability to call plays. You have to get a true gauge of everything. One thing I've always said is the offensive line can wreck a team because you can't hide. You can't hide. If they can't block people, you can't hide. If you can't run when you need to run, when you want to run and when you have to run, you can't hide. This team is going to have a problem hiding. This team is going to have a problem with their ability to push people off the ball when they need to. Does that mean doom and gloom? No, it doesn't, because we saw the Rams and the Bengals in the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, and neither one of them had a real good offensive line, and they both had guys that I consider samurais on their defense. Both teams, DJ Reader, Hendrickson for the Bengals, and then on the other side, of course, Aaron Donald, Von Miller. There's nothing to shake a stick at, right? So both teams were able to play at a high enough level with shaky offensive lines to get to the Super Bowl 1-1 and 1 lost. The Jacksonville Jaguars, there is precedence for them to do that without a dominant offensive line. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. They have to be able to overcome it in another way. It's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult because it's going to depend on the weapons. It's going to depend on some of those hits I talked about in segment 1. It's going to depend on Trevor Lawrence, who's probably going to be running for his life a little bit. It's going to depend on Brian Thomas Jr. Just think back to last year when the team was 9-8 and the offensive line didn't play well. They won 9 games even though receivers were dropping the ball. They won 9 games even though the receivers at one point were pretty much unhealthy and they only had 1 or 2 guys to really throw to in the passing game. They won a playoff game 2 years ago, and the offensive line definitely wasn't no better then than it is now. So it's not doom and gloom. Here's where the blue sky comes in. The blue sky comes in is they've gotten better at their skill positions. That's one thing. So the chances that they'll be able to score more points and scoring points is going to help you get away from the fact that if the game is really, really close and you got to run the ball, you ain't going to be able to do it with a bad offensive line. Or if you're really, really behind and teams are teeing off on your quarterback because they know the running game and play action won't work because you need to throw it. If you score more points, you'll find yourself in those positions less and less. And here's the other part of it. Much like 2017 with Jacksonville, I think this defense is very good. The 2017 team couldn't throw the ball. They might have had a whole bunch of yards, but Allen Robinson was out for the year. Blake Bortles was wildly inconsistent. They really couldn't throw the ball. And it led to, of course, if you're a Jaguar fan, you know that it led to them being super, super conservative and trying to depend on the defense. So now if you have a defense that's close to that, and I think this defense is because I think they're highly of Ryan Nielsen, and I also think of how highly I think of the defensive line because of the overkill in that area where they did not necessarily do enough on the offensive line. The defense is going to be identity. They're going to be a defensive team that actually can still score on offense and manufacture points on offense, even without having a great offensive line. The only time that formula is going to be a problem for me is when they play another really, really good team that can counterbalance some of that stuff, that can counteract a lot of the strengths that they have, that's going to put a lot of pressure on them. So you're talking about teams with great quarterbacks and great weapons. The Bengals, the Ravens, the Chiefs, the Dolphins, the type of teams that they'll run into in a playoff situation. It could be possibly the Browns are that way. There are a few more teams, even teams within the division. Houston, potentially the Indianapolis Colts. That's when it's going to be touch and go. I don't know how many games they're going to lose. I don't know how many they're going to win or how many they're going to lose. But I'll tell you this. Whatever that number is in your head, if you say 11-6, if you say 12-5, if you say 13-4, if you say 8-9, I'm going to tell you a large part of those losses is going to come because the offensive line stunk up the joint. I'm sorry to tell you. I waited to week 12 last year to tell you, hey, man, we got a problem. And they can't fix it when they lost to the 49ers in the manner in which they lost to the 49ers. I'm not waiting that long this time. I'm not telling you the Jaguars can't win some games and be super, super competitive and make a playoff run. I'm not telling you they can't win the Super Bowl. But what I am telling you is this. They better figure out a way. They're going to have to do all of that while going around that offensive line. The offensive line ain't going to lead them through anybody. That's just not going to happen. This falls solely on the shoulders of Trent Baalke. And I've given him credit for a lot of stuff. I even gave him credit for, like I said earlier, from avoiding overpaying people on the offensive line and sticking with your guys and hoping that development, injury, avoiding injuries, and continuity was going to cure it all. I don't think it's just those things, even though those things were an issue. I think it's a talent issue. And ain't nobody, and I know that's not good English, but I'm going to use it because that's what I want to emphasize. Ain't nobody trading you an offensive line in the middle of the season or the beginning of the year that's going to upgrade this team. It's not going to happen. You got to draft them or sign them in free agency. As I said before, it's not an attack on the individuals because as we know, the offensive line got to be like the Four Tops and the Temptations. They got to move together. This is about the fact that as a unit, I am as concerned as I ever was about the interior from guard to guard. That's guard, center guard, GCG. I am so concerned about those guys. Now, they have 10 guys. They can go 10 deep on the offensive line. They got 10 people, 10 NFL caliber players. But to what degree? If you got a whole bunch of guys that are 5.5 out of 10, that means that everybody's a 5.5. Well, that is consistent, right? But it's consistently mediocre. I hope I'm wrong. I don't think I am. Just like you came here today, you might have not have heard what you thought you wanted to hear, but you came anyway because it's Locked On Jaguars and it's your team every day. And I thank you for making us your first listen today. Now go listen to Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. You can find the link to Locked On Fantasy Football in the description so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Speaking of fantasy football, guess what? That means the skill position players are going to be worth a whole bunch in Jacksonville because they're going to have to carry this team and make enough plays to allow our defense to then dictate what happens after that. Josh Allen mentioned something today. I want to give him a shout out. He said, I try to get to know all the local people, man. I try. It's very, very important for me because you guys have your finger on the pulse of the team. He said something like that. I'm paraphrasing. So that feels good to know that. And shout out to my man, Coach Huff, who's been training and been with quarterback Mac Jones since he was a young kid. He shouted out to Houston every day, and I wanted to mention that to y'all too. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Joint practices continue tomorrow. We're going to get all the information we can, go out on the grounds, make sure that we focus on the offensive line again. Let's see if they improve from day to day. And then let's see if those guys that hit, if they can continue to hit every single day so that now we start to expect and have an expectation that they're going to do it. All right, man. Thanks for joining us here again, man, making us your first listen. We appreciate it. Y'all take care of each other, and we'll see you again on Locked On Jaguars.